All right. So today we're going to really get into tort law.
Mhm.
For anyone listening who wants to like really understand it, get those key concepts down and see how it actually plays out, in real life.
Yeah, like a legal literacy crash course without the law school tuition.
Exactly. And we'll be drawing on a couple of great sources today, Fundamentals of Tort Law and this Open University Unit Guide I found. To kind of make this a little less abstract, I always think of tort law kind of like accidentally, bumping into someone and spilling their coffee.
Yeah.
Like you didn't mean to write,
Hmm.
but you caused some harm and you might need to like make things right. And that's kind of the essence of torts,
Yeah.
these civil wrongs that can really have some consequences.
And the interesting thing is tort law is totally separate from criminal law, right?
Yeah.
It's not about punishment. It's about providing remedies for the harm that one person causes another.
Okay, so let's say someone's texting while driving
Yeah.
and they cause an accident. That falls under negligence in tort law, right?
Yep.
But then I was looking at our source material,
Mm.
and it mentions assault being both a tort and a crime. So how does that work?
Yeah, that's a good point. Some actions can actually have both civil and criminal consequences. So like in that car accident example, you'd have the insurance part of things, which is the tort side, and then the driver might also face criminal charges, you see. Or with assault, you could sue the attacker for damages under tort law, but they could also be prosecuted criminally.
So tort law is more about like making the victim whole again, whereas criminal law is about punishment
Yeah,
and preventing more crime.
exactly.
Gotcha. Now, this Open University guys mentions this case, Woodroffe-Hedley, a mountain climber who died. And they use it to really illustrate the aims of tort law.
Oh, it's a really good example. So first you've got this idea of vindication. It's about like uncovering the truth about what happened and figuring out who, if anyone, was to blame.
Right, like in that climbing case, the victim's family wanted answers, right? They wanted someone to be held accountable.
Exactly. And then there's this concept of corrective justice, which is all about like righting the wrong.
Mm.
So in that case, did the guide act negligently, considering the inherent risks of mountain climbing? Tough questions.
And then, of course, there's the financial side of things, compensation.
Uh-huh.
It's about trying to make the victim or their family whole again, at least as much as money could do that.
Right.
And I think in Woodruff-Hedley, the climber's son actually received a pretty substantial sum.
Yeah. And then finally, there's the idea of deterrence. Using the case as a way to prevent similar situations from happening again in the future. So if that guide was found negligent, it kind of sets this precedent that could influence how other guides manage risks going forward.
It makes sense. And, the source material actually points out that these aims don't always perfectly align, especially in activities like mountain climbing, where there's always going to be some level of risk.
Yeah, some inherent risk.
So I guess kind of a basic question now, what sorts of things fall under the big umbrella of tort law? What kind of harm does it actually protect us from?
Well, tort law protects a bunch of different interests. First, you have personal interests, so that includes things like physical injuries, emotional distress, and even harm to your reputation.
Also, like if someone spreads lies about you and it hurts your business, that could be considered a tort.
Exactly. And it also protects economic interests, too. So let's say you lose money because you got some bad financial advice.
Yeah.
That could also be a tort.
Wow.
And then, of course, it protects property interests, like if someone damages your car or your house, things like that.
I'm starting to realize just how much tort law really touches on like every aspect of our lives.
Oh, for sure. And I think a lot of people don't even realize it. And one of the cornerstones of tort law is this concept of negligence, this idea that someone didn't take reasonable care and that caused harm. So that could be anything from, slip and falls in a store to professional malpractice.
Okay, now when we talk about fault, does there always have to be like someone clearly at fault for a tort to occur?
So for the most part, tort law operates on this idea of fault-based liability, meaning that you're held responsible if you were negligent or if you acted intentionally to cause harm.
Right.
But there are some exceptions.
Like strict liability. The example that comes to mind is like running a fireworks show.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you follow all the safety protocols to a T, if someone gets injured,
Mm-hmm.
you might still be held liable because there's just that inherent risk involved, right?
Exactly. And then there's this really fascinating aspect of strict liability called vicarious liability. It's where one party is actually responsible for another person's actions, even if they didn't do anything wrong themselves.
Okay.
And this often applies to employer-employee relationships.
Oh, so like if a grocery store employee doesn't clean up a spill and a customer slips and falls,
Yeah.
the employer could be held responsible even though they didn't personally cause the spill.
Exactly. It's a way to ensure that the injured party actually has recourse, even if the employee can't personally afford to pay the damages.
That makes sense. Now, one thing that always comes up when people talk about torts is this whole idea of a compensation culture, this perception that people are like way too quick to sue these days.
Yeah. It's a very complex issue. The Open University Guide we mentioned actually digs into this idea, and it's not really clear if it's a real trend or just media hype.
Yeah.
I mean, there's this one example they give of a woman who trespassed into a castle moat at like 2:00 a.m.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah. And then she sued.
She sued after trespassing.
Yep. Cases like that just add fuel to that whole compensation culture debate.
It really makes you wonder, right? Like, are we becoming too cautious as a society? Afraid of being sued for like anything and everything?
Yeah, it raises a really important question. Where do we draw the line between personal freedom and responsibility for potential harm?
It's a real balancing act.
It is.
So that kind of leads into another big question. What happens when someone is found liable in a tort case? Like, what are the actual remedies?
Well, there are two primary remedies. The first is damages, which basically means financial compensation.
Okay.
And the second is injunctions, which are essentially court orders telling someone to stop doing something.
So with damages, it's all about trying to restore the victim as much as money can to where they were before the harm occurred, right?
Right.
And the court is the one who decides on that amount.
Precisely.
Okay. Calculating those damages can't always be easy.
It can be really complex, actually, and that's something we'll delve deeper into in the next part of our deep dive.
All right, so stay tuned, everyone. We'll be right back to unpack all the intricacies of damages and more.
Welcome back. We've been really digging into tort law, right? All the basics, the difference between civils and criminal law, those core aims of tort law, and the different interests that it protects. And we even touched on that whole compensation culture thing a bit.
Yeah, and last time we kind of left off on the topic of remedies, specifically damages. It's easy to say, we want to make the victim whole again, but like, how do courts actually figure out the right amount of money?
Yeah, it's definitely not just a simple calculation, is it? When it comes to damages, courts have to consider all sorts of factors. So let's say it's a physical injury case, right? They look at medical expenses, obviously, not just what you've already spent, but potential future costs too, like surgeries, rehabilitation, things like that.
Right, right. That makes sense. But then what about things that are like harder to put an actual price tag on?
Yeah.
Like pain and suffering. How do you quantify something like that?
Yeah, that's where it gets really tricky. I mean, there's no magic formula. Often courts will look at similar cases, and the damages that were awarded in those situations. They also consider like the severity and how long the pain lasts, any emotional distress that's involved, and how the injury has impacted your overall quality of life.
So it's not just about adding up medical bills and lost wages. It's about capturing a broader impact.
Exactly. And in some cases, damages can even go beyond the individual's direct losses. So, for example, loss of consortium is a claim for the loss of companionship and support that a spouse might experience if their partner is seriously injured.
So like if a couple loves to go hiking together every weekend, and then one of them gets injured and can't hike anymore, that could factor into the damages.
Precisely. Tort law recognizes that the harm can extend beyond the person who was directly injured.
That's interesting.
And one interesting point that fundamentals of tort law brings up is that damages are unliquidated. That means the court decides the amount, unlike in a contract where, the payment terms are spelled out beforehand.
So in these cases, having a good lawyer could really make a big difference, huh?
Oh, absolutely. A skilled lawyer can really make sure the evidence is presented well, make strong arguments and advocate for fair compensation.
So let's switch gears for a sec and talk about the other main remedy injunctions. Those are court orders, right?
They are, yeah.
So when would an injunction be more appropriate than damages?
Well, injunctions are usually used to prevent future harm rather than, compensating for harm that's already happened. So they're common in situations like defamation or nuisance or trespass.
Oh, so like if your neighbor's always blasting music late at night and it's keeping you up, you could try to get an injunction to make them stop.
Exactly. Or let's say someone's spreading false rumors about you that are hurting your reputation. You could seek an injunction to try to stop those statements.
So tort law isn't just about reacting to harm. It can be used to prevent it, too.
Right. And it highlights this important point that tort law isn't just about compensation. It's also about deterring future wrongdoing,
Okay.
Fostering this sense of social responsibility.
Okay, so we've covered a lot, right? Definitions, aims, remedies. But one thing I keep thinking about is, does tort law always actually achieve what it sets out to do? I mean, like, are there times when it kind of falls short?
That's a really good question. And it brings us to some of the criticisms and challenges facing tort law. One thing we haven't talked about yet is this concern that tort law can sometimes be, inefficient and expensive.
Right.
I mean, litigation can drag on for years, legal fees can really pile up, and even if you win, a big chunk of the damages might end up going towards those legal costs.
That's a really good point. And even beyond the money, there's like the emotional toll of going through a lawsuit,
Right.
which can be just incredibly draining for everyone involved.
Oh, absolutely. It can be a really tough process. And that's actually why we're seeing this rise in alternative methods, things like mediation and arbitration,
Right.
because they can often be a much faster and less adversarial way to try and resolve these disputes.
Yeah, I can see that. Speaking of challenges, let's go back to that compensation culture idea for a minute. Even if it's not like a completely accurate representation of reality, that fear of frivolous lawsuits can still have real consequences, right?
Oh, for sure. It can definitely create a culture of, extreme caution,
Right.
where individuals and organizations start avoiding any activities that carry even the slightest risk of litigation. And we see this a lot in areas like education and healthcare and recreation, where the potential for accidents is always there.
So you're talking about things like schools cutting back on field trips, or hospitals being super cautious with treatments, or even like parks removing playground equipment,
Yeah.
all because they're afraid of getting sued.
Exactly. And while it's understandable to want to protect yourself from liability, this overcaution can have a negative impact on society as a whole. It can stifle innovation, it can limit opportunities for personal growth, and it can even create like this atmosphere of fear and mistrust.
So how do we find that balance then? How do we make sure that tort law is doing its job, compensating victims and deterring wrongdoing without creating a society that's like totally paralyzed by the fear of being sued?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's something that legal experts and policymakers and even just everyday citizens are really grappling with right now. Where does personal responsibility end and where does the need for accountability begin? Tough questions.
Yeah. Well, I think we've reached a good point to pause for now. We've really covered a lot of intricate and thought-provoking ground in this part of our deep dive.
We have. And in the final part, we'll explore some of those emerging trends and potential reforms that are shaping the future of tort law. So stay tuned.
All right, so welcome back to the deep dive. We spent the last two parts kind of dissecting tort law, right? We talked about all the principles and the aims and the remedies, even some of the criticisms that it faces. But now for this last part, I want to look ahead. You know, what's on the horizon for tort law? What trends and possible reforms are we seeing?
Well, one of the biggest trends right now is the rise of technology in tort litigation, specifically artificial intelligence.
Oh, yeah, AI. Everyone's talking about it.
Right. And for good reason. AI can help lawyers analyze huge amounts of data, do research on relevant case law, even predict the outcome of lawsuits.
So it could potentially make the whole legal process more efficient, maybe even bring down costs.
Exactly.
But I gotta say, you know, I can't help but think about potential bias with AI. I mean, algorithms are only as good as the data they're trained on, right?
That's a really important point, and it's something that legal professionals and ethicists are working hard to address. Transparency and fairness in AI development are absolutely crucial if we want unbiased outcomes.
Couldn't AI also play a role in that whole compensation culture debate we talked about?
Mm.
Could it help sort out the frivolous lawsuits from the ones with real merit?
That's a really interesting idea. AI could definitely be used to analyze patterns in lawsuits, right? Identify common elements of fraudulent claims, flag cases that are likely to be dismissed. It could help courts prioritize the cases that actually have merit and deter people who are just trying to game the system.
So beyond technology, what about legal reforms? Are there any being considered that could really shake things up in tort law?
Yeah. There are definitely ongoing discussions about different reforms. Some of them are focused on addressing those concerns about cost and efficiency that we talked about.
Right.
One idea that's been floated is putting caps on non-economic damages, like those for pain and suffering, which can sometimes lead to those really big payouts.
Yeah, but that one's pretty controversial, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, critics say it would unfairly limit the compensation that victims can receive, especially in cases with really serious or lasting harm.
Oh, absolutely. It's a tough one. Finding that balance between, keeping costs under control and making sure victims are fairly compensated is really tricky.
There's also that loser pays rule I've heard about, where the side that loses a lawsuit has to pay the winner's legal fees. I can see how that might make people think twice about filing frivolous lawsuits.
Right.
But couldn't it also discourage legitimate claims too? especially from people who can't afford to take that risk of losing.
That's a big concern for a lot of people. They worry that it would create a barrier to access to justice,
Yeah.
you know, especially for individuals and small businesses with limited resources.
Seems like there are no easy answers when it comes to reforming tort law. It's such a complex system with so many different interests at play.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
really is. But these conversations are important, right? Considering all these different perspectives and potential solutions, that's how we can try to create a system that's fair and efficient and actually does what it's supposed to do, protect people from harm and make sure there's accountability for wrongdoing.
Well, I think that about wraps up our deep dive into tort law. We've covered a lot of ground, from those basic concepts to the trends that are shaping the future of this whole area of law.
Yeah, it's been a great discussion. I hope it's given everyone listening a better grasp of how tort law works, all its complexities, and how it really affects our lives every day.
And remember, the legal world never stands still, right? It's constantly evolving. So stay curious, keep learning, and hey, who knows? Maybe one of you listening will be arguing a landmark tort case someday. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.